Welcome to my channel. Today we delve into one of the most terrifying and extraordinary stories ever to unfold in the skies, a story of chaos, courage, and survival that proved the human will to live can overcome the impossible. This is the true story of Federal Express Flight 705, a cargo flight that turned into a mid-air battlefield 30,000 feet above the Earth, the kind of nightmare that no one, not even the most experienced pilots, could have ever imagined facing. It began like any other routine evening in April 1994, at Memphis International Airport. The hum of engines filled the air as the crew of FedEx Flight 705 prepared for departure. The captain, David Sanders, was a veteran pilot, calm and composed. His first officer, Jim Tucker, was known for his precision and professionalism, and flight engineer Andy Peterson, the quiet anchor of the team, made sure every system checked out perfectly. The mission was simple: fly a DC-10 cargo jet to San Jose, California, a flight they had done countless times before. The weather was clear, the air smooth, and the flight plan uneventful, but what they didn't know was that someone on board had a deadly plan, one that would turn this peaceful flight into a living hell. The man's name was Auburn Calloway, a former Navy pilot and current FedEx flight engineer, well-liked by colleagues, quiet, intelligent, but hiding a secret no one could see. He had recently been facing termination from the company over falsified flight records, and in his mind, his career, his reputation, and his life were collapsing. So he made a plan, a dark, calculated plan to hijack the plane, kill the crew, and make it look like an accident. He brought with him a guitar case, but inside it was no instrument. It held hammers, a spear gun, and a knife, weapons meant for murder. As he boarded the aircraft, he smiled politely, greeting the crew like an old friend. No one suspected that he was about to unleash one of the most violent attacks ever recorded on an aircraft. The flight took off smoothly at 3:42 p.m., climbing into the clear Tennessee sky. Everything felt routine. The crew chatted casually as the plane stabilized at cruising altitude. Then, in an instant, the normal rhythm shattered. Behind them, Calloway opened his guitar case and pulled out a hammer. He moved swiftly, silently, stepping into the cockpit before anyone could react. The first blow came without warning, slamming into Andy Peterson's skull. Blood splattered across the instrument panel. Confusion erupted. The captain turned in shock just as another swing came down, hitting him hard. Alarms blared as the aircraft tilted dangerously, and the cockpit became a scene of chaos. The struggle for survival had begun. Despite his injuries, Captain Sanders tried to fight back. His head bleeding, his vision blurry, he shouted to Jim Tucker, "He's trying to kill us!" But before Tucker could respond, Calloway swung again, striking him with brutal force. The cockpit was filled with screams, the sound of fists, metal, and chaos as the three men fought for their lives in a space barely big enough for them to move. Tucker, disoriented and half-conscious, somehow managed to grab control of the yoke. The DC-10 pitched violently, throwing Calloway off balance. Cargo shifted in the back, alarms screamed, and the nose of the plane dropped toward the earth. The G-forces pressed everyone against their seats, the crew bleeding and gasping as they fought to stay conscious. From the control tower, radar showed the plane diving at terrifying speed. Air traffic controllers tried to reach the crew, but there was only static. Inside the cockpit, the battle continued. Calloway lunged again, hammer in hand, his eyes wild with rage, but Sanders managed to block him with his arm. The hammer struck bone, shattering it, but the captain refused to give up. Tucker, dazed but alive, made a desperate choice. He pulled the control column hard to one side, throwing the plane into a violent roll. The maneuver slammed Calloway against the wall, buying the crew precious seconds. It was pure instinct, a desperate attempt to use the very machine meant to carry them as a weapon for survival. For nearly half an hour, the three injured men battled for their lives. Sanders' jaw was broken, Tucker had severe head trauma, Peterson's skull was cracked open, but none of them stopped. They knew if Calloway gained full control, they were dead. Somehow, through sheer willpower, they overpowered him, using a fire extinguisher and belts to restrain him. Blood covered every surface of the cockpit. oxygen masks dangled, alarms still shrieked, and the DC-10 trembled from the abuse it had endured. When Tucker radioed back to Memphis, his voice was weak, broken, but steady. "We've been attacked, need to return immediately." The controller froze, not fully understanding what had just been said. "Say again?" The voice came through the radio. "We've been attacked, we're returning, emergency," came the answer. Those words sent shockwaves through the tower. As they turned back toward Memphis, the crew realized how bad their injuries truly were. Blood loss, pain, dizziness, every second felt like eternity, yet they pushed forward. The captain gave what commands he could through broken teeth. Tucker's hands trembled as he worked the controls, and Peterson drifted in and out of consciousness, but together they refused to give up. The DC-10 approached the airport low and fast. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, watching the massive aircraft approach with smoke trailing behind. The landing gear dropped, one engine sputtering. The plane touched down hard, the wheels screeched, and the crowd on the ground could see the cockpit window smeared with red. Somehow, impossibly, the plane stayed on the runway, sliding to a stop. The battle in the sky was over. When rescuers entered the cockpit, what they saw stunned them. 3 men barely recognizable from their injuries, faces swollen and bloodied, uniforms torn, yet alive, and one restrained attacker, unconscious and covered in the same blood. Calloway's plan had failed. The crew had survived the unthinkable. Every one of them was rushed to the hospital. Doctors later said it was a miracle they lived at all. The damage to their skulls, necks, and limbs was catastrophic, yet not one of them had let go of their duty. Not one of them had surrendered control of that plane. In the aftermath, the nation called them heroes. The FAA declared it one of the most extraordinary acts of airmanship in history, and their courage became the standard of training for pilots around the world. In the courtroom months later, Auburn Calloway showed no emotion as the crew recounted the horror, every detail of that flight etched into their minds forever. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but for the men of Flight 705, the scars went beyond the physical. Every night they remembered the sound of the hammer, the smell of blood and smoke, and the moment they realized that the only thing between life and death was their will to fight. Captain Sanders, Jim Tucker, and Andy Peterson all recovered slowly, though none ever returned to commercial flying. Their bravery, however, changed aviation forever. From that day forward, cargo flight security was redefined, cockpit access reinforced, and the world learned just how fragile peace could be when evil hides in plain sight. Years later, survivors and investigators would reflect on the incident, still in awe of what the crew had accomplished. One NTSB official said, "They fought for their lives, and in doing so, they saved not only themselves, but everyone who flies after them." The DC-10, once a machine built for heavy loads, had become a symbol of endurance, of what humans can do when faced with impossible odds, and every pilot who hears the story of Flight 705 learns the same lesson, that courage can fly higher than fear, and even in the darkest moments, light can still find a way through. Thank you for joining me in this powerful true story. If this tale moved you, if it reminded you of the strength it takes to survive when everything falls apart, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this, real accounts of courage, mystery, and survival that remind us how fragile, yet how unbreakable, the human spirit truly is. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next story. As the investigation began into what really happened on that April afternoon, the story of Federal Express Flight 705 stunned even the most experienced aviation experts. The sheer brutality of what took place inside that cockpit was beyond imagination. Investigators had seen mechanical failures, storms, explosions, but never something like this. A battle for survival between crewmates and one of their own, a man trained to fly, who had turned that training into a weapon. What they uncovered in the weeks that followed revealed not just a hijacking attempt, but a psychological descent that could have destroyed countless lives. And yet, what truly fascinated everyone was not the attacker's madness, but the unbelievable strength and bravery of the men who stopped him while keeping a crippled jet in the air. The forensic evidence from the plane told the story clearly. The cockpit was a scene of chaos, blood splattered across the controls, glass shattered, instruments cracked from blunt force, and streaks of crimson where the crew had fought hand-to-hand for their lives. Investigators found the broken hammerheads, the twisted metal of the spear gun, and even marks where the weapon had missed its targets and struck the panels instead. They could hardly believe the plane had landed safely after what it endured. Captain David Sanders, co-pilot Jim Tucker, and flight engineer Andy Peterson had suffered skull fractures, deep cuts, and severe concussions, and yet the flight data recorder showed that the plane had been flown with surgical precision in the final minutes, even as their blood pressure dropped and their vision blurred. Somehow, through pain and shock, they had managed to keep the aircraft alive long enough to return home. When interviewed, the crew's recollections were fragmented, flashes of violence and confusion replayed through trauma. Captain Sanders remembered turning to see Calloway's face, emotionless, cold, as he swung the hammer down. He recalled the sound of bones cracking and the way his vision went white, then red, but what he remembered most was the silence that followed, the eerie sound of the wind outside and the alarm beeps that seemed distant, unreal. Jim Tucker remembered feeling weightless as the aircraft rolled, the G-forces pulling at his body while he fought to steady the controls. His head bleeding, one eye swelling shut, yet his training took over. He remembered thinking, if we're going down fighting, and Andy Peterson, though barely conscious, had moments of lucidity where he tried to help restrain Calloway even while slipping in and out of awareness. Their memories were broken, but their will to survive had remained unshaken. Auburn Calloway, the man responsible, had planned the attack with chilling precision. Investigators discovered that he had cashed out his savings and changed his will before the flight, leaving everything to his ex-wife and children. His goal was to make his death look accidental, so his family could collect life insurance. He intended to kill the crew mid-flight, take control of the aircraft, and crash it deliberately, making it appear as a tragic mechanical failure. He had chosen Flight 705 because he knew it was heavy with fuel, enough to burn for hours if it hit the ground, but what he hadn't counted on was the resolve of the men he targeted. His plan was perfect on paper, but he underestimated human instinct, the raw, unrelenting force of survival that would turn his victims into warriors. During questioning, Calloway showed no remorse. His words were calm, measured, as though he had simply failed a test. When asked why he did it, he replied, "I had no other way out." His tone devoid of emotion, it was chilling to investigators who realized that this man, trained to handle emergencies with composure, had used that very training to calculate how to end lives without hesitation. Psychologists later described his mindset as detached logic, a cold rationalization that saw murder as method, not madness. The court records revealed that he had even plotted the time and altitude that would make recovery impossible, but his calculations hadn't included the unpredictable, human resistance under pressure, and that, in the end, became his undoing. In the months following the attack, the crew underwent countless surgeries, their bones wired, their skin stitched, their nerves repaired, but their spirits remained stronger than ever. Reporters from across the world came to hear their story, yet each of them spoke not as victims, but as professionals who did their duty. Captain Sanders, in an interview, said quietly, "I didn't think about living or dying, I just thought about flying the airplane." His words captured the essence of what made this story unforgettable. Even as blood clouded his eyes, he stayed focused on his instruments, guiding a wounded plane through the sky with one good arm and sheer will. Jim Tucker spent months in rehabilitation, learning to walk again, his head trauma so severe doctors called his recovery miraculous, and yet, when asked what kept him alive, he said, "I wasn't going to let him win." Those 6 words became symbolic of the entire ordeal, an unbreakable defiance that refused to surrender even when everything seemed lost. The NTSB later reconstructed the entire event through simulator tests. Pilots from around the world were invited to attempt the same conditions. The results were staggering. Not a single pilot succeeded in controlling the DC-10 through the maneuvers Tucker had executed during the attack, one test pilot later said. He flew a plane that shouldn't have been flyable, the data confirmed that at one point, the aircraft had rolled more than 100 degrees, almost inverted, while still maintaining altitude. The G-forces alone would have knocked most people unconscious, and yet, somehow, Tucker remained at the controls, his instincts and training guiding his every move. It was an act that bordered on the impossible, proving that even at the edge of consciousness, the human spirit can command the impossible when it refuses to yield. For the investigators, the flight became a turning point in understanding cockpit vulnerability. Up until that day, cargo flights often flew without the same security standards as passenger aircraft. There were no reinforced doors, no surveillance, no safeguards against internal threats, but that changed after Flight 705. New regulations required reinforced cockpit doors on all FedEx and other commercial cargo jets, background checks became stricter, and flight engineers were subject to deeper psychological screenings. What happened in that cockpit redefined not just safety but trust. It was a brutal reminder that danger can come from within, and that vigilance must never rest. Every flight since that day has been protected by procedures written in the blood and courage of those three men. Even after his conviction, Auburn Calloway remained silent in prison, refusing interviews, avoiding any explanation. The world eventually forgot his name, but never the names of the men he tried to kill. Captain Sanders, First Officer Tucker, and Engineer Peterson became legends in aviation circles, their story featured in documentaries, training programs, and classrooms around the globe. Every time a pilot learns emergency management or situational awareness, they unknowingly carry a fragment of their story with them. The courage they showed wasn't a moment of heroism, it was a lifetime of preparation meeting its cruelest test, and in that crucible, they proved what humanity is capable of when everything hangs by a thread. In the quiet halls of the FedEx headquarters, a small plaque now hangs bearing their names. Beneath it are the words, "In courage, we trust." For every crew that departs from Memphis at night, those words are a promise. A reminder that their work is more than logistics, more than flight plans. It's a mission of faith. Faith that the people beside them, no matter the situation, will fight to the very end, for themselves, for their passengers, and for the sky they all serve. Flight 705 was not just an air disaster. It was a story of rebirth, a testament that even in the face of evil, bravery can reclaim the heavens. Back on the ground that day, no one at Memphis International Airport had any idea that a full-scale war was unfolding above them. The controllers at FedEx Operations were monitoring the flight's progress as they always did. The radar blip representing Flight 705 moved steadily westward, smooth and uneventful. Then suddenly, the blip flickered, dipped, and began to deviate from its course. An operator frowned, assuming it was a minor turbulence or a system glitch. But when the transponder didn't respond to their hails, concern turned into panic. Calls flooded through the radio frequencies. FedEx 705, do you copy? No response. Seconds turned into minutes, and the silence grew heavy. Somewhere high above, a DC-10 was fighting not just gravity but madness itself. Inside the cockpit, the chaos had turned into a horrifying rhythm of violence and survival. The floor was slick with blood, panels cracked from impact, oxygen masks swayed from above like silent witnesses to the nightmare. The roar of the engines mixed with the heavy breathing of men locked in a life-or-death struggle. Auburn Calloway, still fueled by rage and adrenaline, fought like a man possessed, his plan unraveling. His mind slipping into a dark corner of obsession, he swung wildly, missing his mark, his own weapon bouncing against metal, yet he refused to stop. The pilots, broken and battered, kept fighting back. Captain Sanders' arm was shattered, his face barely recognizable, but his voice remained steady as he commanded through the chaos. "Jim, get her level, keep us alive." Jim Tucker, his head split open, blood pouring into one eye, reached for the yoke, his fingers shaking. He could feel the plane trembling beneath him. The DC-10 was in an unstable roll. The warning alarms screamed like sirens of doom, altitude dropping fast, the ground rushing up toward them. In a desperate move, he yanked the control column hard, sending the aircraft into a brutal climb. The G-forces crushed them into their seats. Calloway was thrown back by the momentum, slamming into the bulkhead. The sound of his body hitting the wall echoed through the confined space. For a brief second there was silence, just the hiss of oxygen and the creak of metal under stress. Tucker gasped for air, his heart pounding, the cockpit spinning in and out of focus. Every nerve in his body screamed to rest, but rest meant death. The plane's violent movements drew attention from air traffic control. Other aircraft in nearby airspace reported seeing an erratic FedEx jet rolling sharply at high altitude. One pilot radioed, "That DC-10 looks unstable," unaware that inside, the crew wasn't fighting a mechanical fault but a man, one of their own, who had turned their flight deck into a battlefield. As the crew stabilized momentarily, Andy Peterson, drifting in and out of consciousness, tried to move, his hands slick with blood. He reached for a cord, something to tie Calloway's hands, but his vision blurred, and he collapsed again. Sanders turned his head toward him, shouting his name. No response. The captain's voice broke, not out of fear, but out of raw exhaustion and anger. Anger that this betrayal had come from someone they once called a brother. Meanwhile, in the tower, controllers were confused but hopeful when Flight 705 suddenly came back on radar heading east again toward Memphis. A dispatcher tried again. "FedEx 705, confirm return to base?" For a moment, there was only static, then a broken voice answered, faint and slurred, "We've been attacked, need emergency, we're returning now." It was Jim Tucker. His words dragging like they were coming through water. The controller froze, realizing the nightmare truth. This wasn't a technical problem. It was human. The response team mobilized instantly. Emergency crews lined the runway. Fire trucks took position, ambulances waited, and the entire airport fell silent as people watched the skies, not knowing if the plane would ever make it back. Up in the cockpit, the fight wasn't over. Calloway had regained consciousness, staggering to his feet with a snarl, his face bloodied, eyes unfocused but burning with fury. He lunged again, screaming incoherently. The crew had nothing left, no strength, no tools, just instinct. Captain Sanders pushed forward despite his broken arm, grabbing the fire extinguisher beside the seat and swinging it with his last ounce of power. It connected with a dull, heavy sound. Calloway fell again, this time slower. The air went still. The crew slumped back, barely breathing, their bodies wrecked but their minds locked on one goal: get the plane down. Tucker glanced at the gauges. The hydraulics were sluggish, controls barely responsive. His vision tunneled. He fought nausea, fought pain, fought darkness. "Stay with me," the captain muttered, voice shaking. "We're not done yet." The final 20 minutes of that flight were among the most harrowing in aviation history. Tucker, operating half-blind, guided the massive jet toward Memphis using instinct more than sight. The cockpit reeked of blood and smoke, the air thick and heavy, the alarms still flashing in red. Every mile felt endless. On the ground, people stared up at the sky, seeing the approaching jet descend far too fast. Emergency lights flashed along the runway, paramedics gripping stretchers, praying that somehow, by miracle, the crew would hold it together. As the aircraft neared the ground, Tucker's body gave out, his muscles locking. Sanders reached over with his shattered arm to adjust the throttle, and together, through sheer will, they forced the DC-10 into alignment with the runway lights. The wheels hit the ground with a violent screech, sparks flew from the undercarriage, the massive jet bounced once, then slammed down again, the tires burned, smoke trailed. The plane swerved but held, finally slowing, skidding to a halt halfway down the runway. Fire crews surrounded it instantly, the sound of sirens blending with the hiss of the engines winding down. Inside, all three men were slumped over, bleeding, unconscious but alive. Rescuers broke through the cockpit door there, flashlights cutting through the dim haze. The sight that met them froze everyone in their tracks. The walls drenched in blood, broken glass everywhere, and the restrained form of Calloway lying motionless in the corner. The first paramedic whispered, "Dear God, what happened in here?" As they pulled the crew out, one by one, medics realized how close to death they had been. Tucker's skull fracture had pressed dangerously close to his brainstem, Sanders' arm had been crushed, and Peterson's scalp wound was so deep his skull was visible, yet somehow, through sheer defiance, they had not only survived, they had flown. When word spread that the flight had landed, disbelief rippled through the airport. People ran toward the tarmac, unable to comprehend how such a brutal scene could end in survival. News cameras caught the flashing lights, the stretchers being rolled away, the blood-streaked fuselage of the FedEx jet gleaming under the night sky. It was chaos, but this time, it was the kind born from awe rather than horror. In the hours that followed, the NTSB, FBI, and FedEx executives arrived, piecing together the fragments of an event that would become legend. As investigators walked through the aircraft, they could almost feel the echo of the struggle, the vibration of fear still clinging to the walls. One investigator later said, "It looked less like an airplane and more like a crime scene," and that's exactly what it was. But behind the brutality, there was something far greater. Proof of human resilience. Proof that even when trapped in a metal coffin miles above the earth, bleeding and broken, courage can take the controls and fly through hell itself. That day, 3 men became symbols of defiance, rewriting the boundaries of what survival truly means in the sky. As dawn broke over Memphis, the sun rose on the tail of the DC-10, its purple and white paint streaked with soot and dried blood, a sight no one who saw it would ever forget. In the hospital nearby, Sanders, Tucker, and Peterson lay in silence, each in separate rooms, hooked to machines, breathing slowly, but alive. Doctors called it nothing short of divine intervention, but those who knew better understood it wasn't divine. It was human. It was willpower, teamwork, and the raw instinct to protect one another no matter the cost. And in that silence of recovery, the world outside was already preparing to ask one question: how did they do it? How did they win a fight no one could have survived? When dawn finally broke over Memphis, the city was just waking up to the headlines that would soon circle the globe. Chaos at 30,000 feet. FedEx crew survives mid-air battle. Reporters flooded the hospital grounds as paramedics wheeled in the 3 men who had defied death itself. Inside, the corridors filled with murmurs. Doctors whispering about injuries no one should have lived through, police officers standing guard outside rooms where heroes lay unconscious. Captain David Sanders, his jaw wired shut and his arm mangled, had lost more blood than doctors thought survivable. First Officer Jim Tucker, his skull fractured in 2 places, drifted in and out of awareness, asking if the plane was still flying. And Andy Peterson, barely breathing, had pieces of metal and bone lodged in his scalp, but even then, nurses said he kept trying to speak, muttering words that sounded like, "secure the plane." The instinct to protect, to control, to finish the mission, it was still alive in all of them. The FBI wasted no time. Within hours, investigators were inside the FedEx DC-10, cameras flashing across a cockpit that looked like the aftermath of a war zone. Blood spattered across the ceiling, shattered dials, torn wiring, the metallic smell of iron thick in the air. On the floor lay a twisted guitar case, the same case that had held Auburn Calloway's weapons of death. Next to it, the spear gun, its metal prongs bent from impact, and a hammer stained dark red. The agents stood in silence, realizing they weren't looking at a hijacking, they were looking at an execution plan that had failed by inches. It was methodical, deliberate, and horrifyingly personal. The attacker hadn't just wanted to take the plane. He wanted to erase everyone inside it. As Calloway was taken into custody, barely conscious and covered in blood not his own, his calmness unsettled everyone. He said nothing. No screams, no excuses, just silence. When agents asked why he had done it, he looked up, eyes emotionless, and said, "You wouldn't understand." The investigation uncovered what he never intended anyone to find. His entire financial world had collapsed. He was facing termination for falsified flight hours, a disgrace that would end his aviation career forever. He was divorced. His life insurance was the only thing left he thought he could leave behind, and his twisted logic told him the only way to save face was to die in a crash that looked accidental. The plan had been perfect in his mind. Kill the crew, disable communications, dive the plane, and make it appear like a catastrophic failure. He had chosen Flight 705 because its fuel load was enough to burn for hours, ensuring no one could ever question what happened. What he didn't calculate was that even in the face of death, people fight back. The more investigators examined the flight recorders, the more astonished they became. The black box captured fragments of the horror, the sounds of the struggle, grunts, the thud of metal striking flesh, alarms blaring, oxygen masks falling, then the groaning strain of the engines as Tucker performed maneuvers no simulator had ever replicated. Analysts calculated that at one point, the aircraft endured over 5.5 gs of force, enough to knock out most humans. Yet Tucker, somehow conscious and bleeding, had stayed in control. In simulator tests, no pilot could replicate his feat, some even blacked out attempting to match his input. One investigator later said, "He flew that plane with the instincts of a man already halfway to death." Back in the hospital, when Jim Tucker finally awoke, his first words weren't about himself. They were about the plane. "Did we make it?" he whispered. The nurse nodded, tears in her eyes. "You made it home." Tucker smiled weakly, whispering, "Good." Captain Sanders, even with his face swollen and jaw wired shut, managed to write a note asking for updates on the flight's final approach. Andy Peterson's first question was whether the cargo was secure. To the doctors, it was surreal. These men weren't just survivors, they were professionals who had faced the unthinkable and still thought like aviators. That discipline, that composure, was what had saved them all. When the public learned what happened, the nation was stunned. This wasn't a technical failure or an act of terrorism, it was betrayal from within, something no one had prepared for. News channels played footage of the battered DC-10, the gouges on its fuselage, the shattered cockpit windows. For the first time in history, people saw what courage in the sky truly meant. FedEx issued statements calling the crew a testament to professionalism and bravery. Pilots around the world sent messages of respect. The aviation community, shaken to its core, began rewriting safety protocols overnight. The FAA issued directives mandating reinforced cockpit doors, psychological evaluations for crew members, and new emergency codes for hijack attempts, even on cargo flights. Meanwhile, Auburn Calloway's trial began, and the world saw the face of the man who nearly destroyed everything. The courtroom was tense, journalists packed the seats, and behind the prosecution table sat the three men he had tried to murder, still bandaged, still healing, but alive. As the details came out, the weapons, the plan, the cold calculation, the jury's faces hardened. Sanders' testimony was brief but powerful. He simply said, "He tried to kill us all. We stopped him." Jim Tucker, still suffering from memory gaps, described flashes, the sound of metal, the taste of blood, and the moment he decided he would rather die flying than let Calloway win. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent, life in prison without parole. The man who had planned to die in a crash would instead live the rest of his life behind bars, haunted by the courage of the men who refused to die with him. For the crew, recovery was long and painful, but the world refused to let their story fade. They were awarded the Airline Pilots Association Gold Medal for heroism, the highest honor a pilot can receive. When they stood on stage, still bearing scars, the crowd rose in a standing ovation that lasted minutes. Reporters described the moment as the loudest silence in aviation history, because no words could truly express what they had done. They didn't just save themselves, they changed aviation forever. Years later, when Captain Sanders retired, he was asked what he remembered most from that day. He paused for a long time, eyes distant, then said quietly, "The sound of my co-pilot breathing. That's when I knew we were still alive." Jim Tucker went on to teach flight simulation, helping train new pilots on how to remain calm in chaos. Andy Peterson, though he never fully recovered his strength, became a mentor for younger engineers, teaching them that systems are only as strong as the humans who operate them. Their lives had been scarred, but their spirits had become something greater, a symbol of resilience, proof that heroes don't wear capes, they wear uniforms stained with sweat and blood. In aviation schools across America, Flight 705 became more than a case study. It became a creed. Trainees were told, "Remember the FedEx crew, remember what humans can do when the world falls apart." Their names were spoken not with sorrow, but with reverence. And even today, when a pilot runs through emergency checklists, or a flight engineer glances over control readings in the quiet of the cockpit, somewhere in their training lives the memory of that day, the reminder that courage isn't built in the moment of disaster, it's forged long before, in the discipline to never give up, no matter the odds. So, when you see a FedEx plane flying overhead, slicing through the night sky with lights glowing faintly against the dark, know that it carries more than cargo. It carries legacy, courage, and the unbroken spirit of the men who fought for their lives in the silence of the clouds. And somewhere, high above the world, their story still echoes, a whisper against the wind, saying that even in chaos, humanity can rise above fear. The weeks that followed the attack on Flight 705 were filled with pain, disbelief, and endless questions. The crew members lay in their hospital beds under the soft glow of fluorescent lights, their bodies broken but their spirits somehow unbowed. Outside, reporters waited day and night for updates, and inside, the smell of antiseptic mixed with the quiet hum of heart monitors became the rhythm of their recovery. Captain David Sanders could barely speak, his jaw wired shut, but when the nurses wrote him notes asking if he wanted to dictate a message for the media, he shook his head. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested only in one thing, the truth being told, so that no one else would ever face what they did again. Federal Express executives visited the hospital daily, their faces pale, their voices subdued. They had seen the cockpit photos, the blood-soaked seats, and the twisted remains of instruments. Even hardened investigators couldn't hold back emotion when they walked into that DC-10. The company vowed that nothing like this would ever happen again. They immediately began implementing changes. Stricter background checks, tighter security screenings, psychological evaluations for flight engineers and pilots, and new cockpit safety protocols. For the first time, cargo aircraft were treated with the same level of scrutiny as passenger flights. The tragedy that had unfolded high above Tennessee became a wake-up call for the entire aviation industry. Meanwhile, the investigators continued their work. They studied every detail of Calloway's preparation, the forged logbooks, the financial stress, the quiet resentment that had been brewing for months. They learned that he had meticulously planned the attack for days. He had chosen the hammer for one reason. It would cause severe head trauma without immediately killing, allowing him to take over the plane while the crew was incapacitated. He had brought the spear gun to finish the job if anyone resisted. He had even calculated the exact moment in the flight when he would strike, after takeoff, when radio communication was minimal, and before the plane reached altitude too high to recover from a dive. He had expected obedience, but what he got was resistance. Fierce, primal, unstoppable resistance that shattered every calculation he made. Doctors later said the crew's survival bordered on impossible. Jim Tucker's skull fracture was so severe that part of his brain was exposed. Surgeons spent hours repairing it. Captain Sanders lost over half his blood volume before landing. Andy Peterson's scalp wound was so deep it required more than 200 stitches. Yet all three of them had continued functioning, making decisions, giving commands, and flying an aircraft with precision through the pain. One trauma specialist told the press, they shouldn't have been conscious, let alone capable of landing a jet. But that's what made the story legendary, the human body breaking, but the mind refusing to surrender. As the months passed, public fascination with the case only grew. Documentaries were made, news programs replayed dramatic reenactments, and headlines painted the crew as symbols of heroism under pressure. People across the country sent letters to their hospital rooms. Handwritten notes from strangers saying things like, "You reminded me what courage looks like." Among the thousands of letters, one stood out. It came from a former pilot who had lost his career after an accident. He wrote, "I thought my life was over until I read about you. You made me believe again that we can all rise, no matter how far we fall." Sanders asked the nurse to read that one again. When she did, tears rolled down his bruised face. When the time came for Auburn Calloway's sentencing, the courtroom was packed. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Reporters scribbled furiously, camera shutters clicked like a heartbeat, and the air seemed to tighten as the man in shackles entered the room. Calloway's face remained blank, expressionless. No apology. No remorse. Just the same cold stare that had haunted the crew's nightmares for months. As the victims testified, there wasn't a sound in the room. Jim Tucker's voice trembled slightly as he described the moment. He realized what was happening, how his vision went dark but his hands refused to let go of the controls. Sanders, jaw still stiff from surgery, spoke through measured words, saying, "We fought for our lives, but we also fought for every person who trusts the sky." When the verdict was read, life in prison without parole, a quiet sigh swept through the room. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. Calloway was taken away, his fate sealed behind steel bars, but for the three men who stopped him, the journey was far from over. Healing was a long road, not just for their bodies but for their minds. Jim Tucker struggled with balance and memory, sometimes waking up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, hearing phantom alarms. Sanders found it hard to sit in a cockpit again. The smell of engine oil brought flashes of that day. Andy Peterson couldn't close his eyes without seeing the hammer coming toward him. They all went through years of therapy, counseling, and quiet reflection. But instead of letting trauma define them, they decided to turn it into something greater: purpose. FedEx honored them with the company's highest award for heroism, and the aviation world followed suit. The Airline Pilots Association Gold Medal for Heroism was presented to the crew in a ceremony that left even hardened aviators wiping away tears. The applause thundered for minutes as the three men stood together on stage, no longer victims, but legends. Behind them played footage of a DC-10 soaring above the clouds, and the announcer's voice said, "They turned chaos into control, fear into strength, and near death into history." It was not just recognition. It was closure. Years later, Jim Tucker would go on to share his experience in lectures, speaking to aviation students about the importance of mental readiness and composure under duress. His message was always simple: courage doesn't mean you aren't afraid. It means you keep flying anyway. Captain Sanders, though he never returned to commercial flying, became a mentor to younger pilots and a consultant on aviation safety. Andy Peterson retired quietly, preferring solitude, but every year on the anniversary of the incident, the three men met privately for dinner in Memphis. They rarely talked about the attack, but each time they parted ways, they shook hands a little longer than necessary, silently acknowledging that what bound them went far beyond friendship. The DC-10 that carried them through that nightmare was eventually decommissioned, but before it was dismantled, FedEx preserved a section of the cockpit and turned it into a safety exhibit at their training center. Pilots in training still walk through that display, the bloodstains cleaned but the dents in the metal left untouched, a physical reminder of what happens when bravery meets chaos head-on. Some say you can still feel the energy there, an almost reverent silence as if the walls themselves remember the voices of the men who refused to die. Decades have passed, yet the legacy of Flight 705 continues to shape aviation. The protocols that exist today, reinforced cockpit doors, behavioral monitoring programs, psychological evaluations for crew members, all trace back to that one flight. Every safe journey flown since then carries a little piece of their story. The sky remains the same, vast, indifferent, and unpredictable, but because of three men who fought with nothing but courage and grit, it is safer now than ever before. So the next time you see a FedEx jet streaking across the night sky, think of that flight, the one where 3 ordinary men became extraordinary. Remember that inside every cockpit is a quiet promise, one written in blood and determination: we will never give up, no matter what tries to bring us down. Because Flight 705 didn't just fall into chaos, it climbed out of it, proving that even when darkness fills the cockpit, the light of human courage will always find a way through. Years later, when the chaos of that April day had faded into memory, the legend of Federal Express Flight 705 continued to echo across the world of aviation like a whisper carried by the wind. Long after the blood was cleaned and the wreckage dismantled, the story refused to die because it wasn't just a story of survival, it was a story of what happens when human instinct, courage, and brotherhood collide with pure madness in the most unforgiving place imaginable. The sky, the tale of those 3 men became a symbol of what pilots everywhere silently fear and secretly hope, that when the moment comes and everything goes wrong, they will have the strength to rise above it. Captain David Sanders often said later that there were nights he couldn't sleep without hearing the sound of engines, not the rhythmic hum of a healthy flight, but the roar of a plane struggling to stay in the air while 3 men bled on its floor. He described those sounds as the ghosts of the sky, reminders of what they'd been through and what they'd overcome. For him, the cockpit was both sanctuary and scar, a place where death had once stood just a breath away but had been forced to retreat. His body had healed, but the memory lived on like a quiet heartbeat in the back of his mind, yet even through the pain, he found gratitude. He often told interviewers, "We walked into hell and flew out of it, and I wouldn't trade that lesson for anything." Jim Tucker's journey after the attack was different but equally haunting. The head injuries he sustained left him with occasional tremors and flashes of memory loss, yet he refused to be defined by trauma. Instead, he turned it into purpose, teaching younger pilots the value of composure under unimaginable pressure. In every classroom, his voice carried a calm gravity, and when students asked him how he did it, how he kept flying when his world was literally falling apart, he would pause, look out the window and say, "Because someone had to, and if not me, then who?" Those simple words became a mantra across aviation schools, a lesson more valuable than any textbook. Because courage isn't born in the moment you face danger, it's built in every flight, every routine, every promise you make to those who trust you to bring them home. Andy Peterson was the quietest of the 3. He never sought interviews, never appeared on television. His scars were visible, but his silence spoke louder than words. He spent his retirement mentoring new engineers and mechanics, reminding them that safety isn't about machines. It's about people. He often said, "We can fix planes, but we can't fix hesitation." He knew better than anyone that every bolt, every circuit, every check mattered, that the smallest oversight could one day mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. When asked why he stayed connected to aviation after such trauma, he simply smiled and said, "Because I'm still here, and that means I have work to do." The investigation into Flight 705 became a cornerstone in aviation safety reform. What happened that day reshaped everything from cockpit protocols to psychological screenings for flight crew. Before the attack, cargo flights were considered low risk, with little focus on internal threats. After the incident, that illusion shattered, new security measures were introduced worldwide, background checks deepened, mental health evaluations became routine, and cockpit doors were reinforced even in non-passenger aircraft. The lesson was clear. Danger doesn't always come from outside the plane. Sometimes it wears the same uniform, sits in the same briefing, and smiles as it boards. The legacy of 705 ensured that never again would such oversight exist. It was a brutal education, but one that saved countless lives in the years that followed. As the decades rolled on, Flight 705 became part of aviation lore, featured in documentaries, recreated in flight simulators, and discussed in safety conferences around the world. Yet no dramatization, no television reenactment could truly capture what those men felt in that cockpit. The suffocating fear, the confusion, the ringing in their ears as alarms screamed and blood blurred their vision. One flight instructor who used the incident in training said, "When I show my students this case, I tell them, this isn't just about flying, this is about being human. This is what it looks like when professionalism and instinct merge into one, when you're too injured to move but still find a way to keep the wings level." For FedEx, the event became a turning point. It transformed the company from a logistics empire into a leader in aviation safety. Every pilot who joined after 1994 was taught the story of 705, not as tragedy but as triumph. Every anniversary of the incident, a quiet moment of silence was observed in their main hub. No speeches, no cameras, just respect. In the company's training center, a piece of the original DC-10's cockpit was preserved behind glass, the metal still bearing faint dents from that day. The plaque beneath it reads, "Courage doesn't require wings, only the will to fight for them," and new pilots often stop there before their first flight, pressing their hand to the glass as a promise to remember what those before them endured so they would never have to. But the story didn't end with aviation, it rippled far beyond it. Across industries and generations, psychologists studying human resilience used Flight 705 as a prime example of survival under extreme duress. Military academies analyzed it as a case study in composure and leadership under chaos, and ordinary people found inspiration in it, because it wasn't just about flying, it was about fighting for life itself, about the moment when everything breaks and you discover what's left inside you. Captain Sanders once said, "We didn't survive because we were strong, we survived because we refused to stop." That refusal, raw, defiant, human, became the heartbeat of their legacy. In time, the three men aged, their faces lined not just by years but by memory. Their reunions grew smaller, quieter, but every time they met, they would sit for hours, saying little, just drinking coffee, sometimes laughing, sometimes falling silent, each man lost in thought. One night, Jim Tucker looked at the others and said softly, "You know, we should have died that day." Sanders nodded slowly, replying, "Maybe we did, maybe part of us did, but what's left? That's the part that lived for a reason." None of them needed to say anything more, they understood each other without words, bound forever by those 30 brutal minutes that had changed everything. Today, Flight 705 is more than an entry in a safety manual, it's a living testament to what human beings can endure and overcome. Every time a DC-10 or any cargo jet soars into the dark, quiet skies above America, it carries their story in spirit, in the stillness between engine hums, in the faint glow of cockpit lights. Their courage still flies, unseen but unforgettable, reminding the world that even in the face of betrayal and chaos, there are still those who will fight to the last breath to bring a plane home. So if you ever find yourself watching the night sky, seeing the faint silhouette of a jet crossing the horizon, remember them. Captain Sanders, First Officer Tucker, and Engineer Peterson, the men who turned terror into triumph, whose blood written across the walls of a DC-10 became the ink for new safety standards. Their pain became progress, their fight became faith, and their survival became legend. Thank you for listening to this extraordinary journey, one that proves the sky doesn't just belong to machines, it belongs to those with the courage to challenge it. If this story inspired you, if it made you believe in the strength of the human spirit, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. There are more true stories waiting, tales of tragedy, triumph, and the power that lives in all of us when we refuse to fall. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and always remember, the sky is unforgiving, but courage can make even the impossible possible.